I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're going to be talking about my second favorite American of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln may hold pride of places first, but second and not far behind in my pantheon of American heroes is the great Frederick Douglass. We're going to be talking, though, about an interesting aspect of his life, his thought, and his legacy, which is his constitutional understanding and arguments, particularly as it relates to the abolition of slavery. I'm joined for that conversation today by our guest, Bradley Rebeiro. Brad is Associate Professor of Law at Brigham Young University Law School. He teaches courses there, of course, on the U.S. Constitution, and he has now got a wonderful book coming out soon, right, Brad? Soon?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Called Until Every Yoke is Broken, Frederick Douglass's Constitutional Abolitionism. And we're looking forward to that book. Let me highly recommend that book because I've read other things that Brad has written. It's terrific, it's deep, it's thoughtful, it's serious, but it's also very engaging writing, which you don't always get from law professors.
I
But we have
appreciate
it
it.
from this law professor today. So again, let me recommend his book, Until Every Yoke is Broken. Brad, thanks for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. And who knows? Let's see if by the end of this I can, convert Douglas to your number one American.
It might not take much of a push. Of course, as you know, our listeners are typically very well informed. I'm sure almost all of them, if not all, have heard of the great Frederick Douglass. But to situate him, to put a little context for your argument, remind us again, who was Frederick Douglass?
Yeah. So Frederick Douglass, I guess, put it most succinctly, former slave, turned activist, turned statesman. So Frederick Douglass, he was born a slave somewhere around 1818. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact date, right? Because they didn't really keep records of the birth date of slaves. But he's born into slavery, and around 20 years old or so, he was in Maryland and he was contracting out his work, which was sort of a common practice at the time for some slaves. They could go and they could seek their own work. And if they made more money than a certain set value, then they can retain some of that money for themselves. So under this sort of arrangement, Douglas tucked away significant funds for his bid for freedom. And impersonating a free Black sailor, he traveled by train, eventually winding up in New York. And not long thereafter, gets roped into what you might call the Garrisonian camp. He met William Lloyd Garrison, a famous abolitionist, and that's how he got roped into the abolitionist movement. And then from there, he developed his own understanding of the nature of the Union itself, of the Constitution. There's a lot that happens in between. So he writes this interesting book called My Bondage and My Freedom. It's a narrative of his time as a slave. Because interestingly, Douglas was so erudite and so articulate that people didn't actually believe he was a former slave. So he had to prove that he was a former slave by writing this narrative. But for those who are aware of American history, this is around 1850 when a reinvigorated Fugitive Slave Act is passed. And this very narrative that proves his former servitude also provides ample evidence for slave catchers to be able to find him and take him back to slavery. So he has to escape to England, and there he continues to really give a lot of addresses in Scotland and England and other places, advocating for abolitionism, but also he has a little bit more time to himself to carefully study what he, as he terms, the nature of law, rights, and the principles of government. And by the time he returns to the United States, he now has a renewed vision of what he understands the Constitution to be. Where in the past, it was literally an instrument that was used in order to not only keep him captive, but potentially return him to servitude. Now he believed it was a glorious liberty document. And from there, he joins what you might call political abolitionists, who give arguments in favor of abolition, and specifically using the Constitution as a means to achieve abolitionism.
That's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about the context of U.S. abolitionism before Douglass goes to England in the late 1840s, 1850, and he returns? You mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. What are the different views among abolitionists about whether or not the United States Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery, and what the disposition of abolitionists should be toward politics?
Yeah, so let me start maybe with the 1830s, in fact. So this is where William Lloyd Garrison is really starting to gain prominence. His prominent press, The Liberator, might be the leading, or maybe the best abolitionist press, right, in the Union, the most influential. So in the 1830s, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, their typical approach was what you might call moral suasion. It was a largely religious movement, a movement that sought to convince Southern slaveholders of the inherent sin that is associated with slaveholding. And if they were to be true Christians and right themselves with God, they must release their slaves. This was generally the tactic. Now, as it related to the Constitution, there were some inflection points, right? So in the 1830s, there's also interesting debate in Congress over the slave trade, for instance. Now, we all know the slave trade had ended in 1808, but what maybe some don't know is that the slave trade actually continued, if not through the states, but it continued through DC, right? So if you were importing slaves through federal land or federal territory, it was not covered in the ban on the slave trade. So this was addressed in Congress in the 1830s, and William Lloyd Garrison, as well as several other abolitionists, they actually tried their hand at some legal arguments as to why Congress should ban the slave trade. Now, a lot of it is still tied to this idea of moral suasion, but they find that their efforts largely are unsuccessful. And in fact, in Congress, there's a gag order instituted that there can be no petitions or even considerations around slavery or the slave trade, right? And this was basically a Southern push to know, well, if we can quell debate, then we'll just keep the status quo, which is we'll continue to import slaves, right? Through DC. So at this point, William Lloyd Garrison and others of his ilk are becoming a little disenchanted, right, with the Constitution. But the real change happens in 1840 when James Madison's notes on the convention are published. So with these notes, William Lloyd Garrison and many of his followers, they come to their own conclusion that the Constitution clearly was a pro-slavery document. And I think this was colored in some respects with their own political experiences up to that point, where they were just largely unsuccessful, right, in their either anti-slavery or abolitionist bids. So yeah, I'd say in 1840s, and this is when Douglass escapes to freedom, the abolitionist position effectively is the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. So if we want abolition, we must disassociate ourselves from that document.
So what happens then when Frederick Douglass goes to England in the late 1840s, 1850? What does he study? What arguments has he begun to encounter, and what does he encounter there that begin to shift his mind?
Yeah, so I would say it's twofold. So one, there's some American influences, and then on the other side, there's some European influences, if you will. So on the American side, you start to have some tracts or pamphlets being published strictly defending the Constitution against pro-slavery efforts. So Lysander Spooner was maybe the first or maybe the most prominent in this regard. He wrote a book called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. He published this in 1845 in Boston. And he marshaled forth really interesting arguments concerning how we should interpret the Constitution. And if we interpret the Constitution correctly, we can only come to the conclusion that it is anti-slavery in nature. William Goodell is another person that Douglass cites. He also around this time wrote his own tract views on the unconstitutionality of American slavery. And then finally, he credits Gerrit Smith specifically. Gerrit Smith is at this point sort of a pen pal, if you will. He's very much a political abolitionist, one who believed that you should use political means and the Constitution to fight slavery. So Douglass credits these men and their writings with this changed position. Now, at the same time, while he's in England, he's continuing to read. And George Combe, for instance, part of the Scottish Enlightenment, I think he has just a lot of influences. He's very well read. Unfortunately, at that time, we can't always track exactly who read who because they aren't as painstakingly citing, right? For instance, their ideas, but he does name, like I said, those three American authors. But I think also the Enlightenment and then even the Scottish Enlightenment in general is really affecting the way he's understanding law and understanding government.
So when Douglass returns to the United States then in the 1850s, when do we start to see this shift and him start to break away from the Garrisonian view of the Constitution and start to argue that the Constitution, as you put it previously, is a glorious liberty document?
So, well, you have to look very closely at the Frederick Douglass papers because in public, you don't see it quite yet. He returns and he is still in public denouncing the Constitution, denouncing any sort of political activism, but in private letters to Gerrit Smith and some others, he is flirting with the idea of a political approach to abolitionism
Fascinating.
and anti-slavery constitutionalism. Now, my theory on this is that Douglass, the same thing that led him to freedom, is the same reason why he couldn't just simply adopt the pro-constitution position, if you will, because he was writing things such as I can understand the pragmatic approach to a pro-slavery constitution, or sorry, a anti-slavery constitution. Why he put it some in the terms of something like why put our arms to the laboring oar of a pro-slavery constitution that is just helping Southerners? That doesn't make sense. But he's not publicly committing himself to this in part because he needed to arrive at this conclusion himself. I don't think he was satisfied with simply adopting what someone else wrote about it or how someone else thought about it. And so he has this really interesting amalgamation, I would say, of the different approaches to the anti-slavery constitution and developed his own sort of method.
And is this connected at all? I'm thinking of political developments in the 1840s and 50s of, for example, the Republican Party and other previous parties like the Liberty Party, which seem to be making political movements based on the notion that somehow the Constitution is not in principle pro-slavery. Where is Frederick Douglass in that constellation when he returns from England in the 1850s?
Yeah, so I would say he is in the same way flirting with those parties, right? In the same way that he was flirting with the anti-slavery constitution. So Gerrit Smith, for instance, is a close pen pal at this point and eventually becomes a benefactor, helps Douglass set up his press, the Frederick Douglass Papers. Well, it was first the North Star and then becomes the Frederick Douglass Papers. But so Gerrit Smith is a part of the Liberty Party, right? He runs on a Liberty Party ticket. So he definitely has close friends, right, who are very much engaged in those efforts. But Douglass keeps himself aloof for some time. And as it relates to the Republican Party, right, so 1854 is when you first see Salmon Chase, Charles Sumner, Joshua Giddings, right? They are becoming completely dissuaded with or disenchanted with the Democratic Party, where they thought independent Democrats might, right, champion an anti-slavery position. That's not successful. The Whigs, yeah, there's some anti-slavery sentiment there, not quite enough. And they realize it has to be something like the Free Soil or Liberty Party combined with, let's say, disenchanted folks from either of the two major parties that formed this Republican Party in 1856, right? And Frederick Douglass at this time, to be frank, he was not a fan of the Republican Party. Now, part of this is because the distinct positions on the Constitution. The Republican Party supported an anti-slavery Constitution, and at this point, I think it might be helpful to clarify that if we're to, split hairs on this, Frederick Douglass was more for an abolitionist constitution as
Oh,
opposed to an
good.
anti-slavery
Let's
one.
pause on that. I think that seems like a
Yeah,
very important point that you're making. What is the difference then between, say, Douglas's anti-slavery constitution and, say, abolition constitution and Abraham Lincoln's anti-slavery constitution? Because on the surface, they seem like the same thing, but you're drawing our attention to the possibility of a very distinct difference.
that's right. So Abraham Lincoln, he would have what in our new terminology, let's say an anti-slavery constitution, and this is sort of the literal position of the Republican Party. You can go look it up, 1856. Look up the Republican Party's platform, and this is Abraham Lincoln's position on the Constitution. Their understanding was the Constitution could be summed up in a simple motto: uh, slavery local, freedom national. So the idea was that where in the Union, anywhere in the United States or in the territories that was under federal jurisdiction, had to lean towards freedom. The idea was because of the Bill of Rights that applied to the federal government, they could not sanction slavery anywhere in the Union, anywhere in the territories. However, the federal government is one of limited jurisdiction. The states have general jurisdiction, right? So within their territories, they can preserve and promote slavery, frankly, as much as they want. And this is something that the federal government simply could not intervene with. And now, from our perspective, that might seem giving up the game, but giving up the game towards pro-slavery efforts. But if you look at it closely, especially at the political dynamics of the time, this was a huge step. The idea that slavery could not be permitted in any of the territories, that would mean that there would be no new slave state coming into the Union. What would that mean? That would mean representation in Congress would fundamentally shift. So from 1790 until 1860, more or less, you have Southern control of both houses, of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Most, if not all, legislation had a pro-slavery tint to it or pro-slavery lean, right? Whether it was regulating the territories, whether it was even like taxation, tariffs, etc. These things all favored slave states. So if you can imagine, if you're a slave state at the time, the idea that there's not going to be any new slave states, that becomes an existential crisis to your very existence in the Union. Lincoln understood this, Republicans understood this, and therefore they thought, we'll play the long game. If we could just stop new states from being slave states, any state coming in being a free state, then we know, right, that slavery will go down this path of ultimate extinction, right, in the words of Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists of his ilk, they believed that the Constitution actually had ample powers to eradicate slavery everywhere in the states. This is in part because they rejected what we can call the Barron Doctrine. So Barron v. Baltimore in 1833 was an important Supreme Court case that said that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. Well, Frederick Douglass and others just simply disagreed, right? So they looked at the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause, and said, well, obviously all slave laws violate life, liberty, and property without due process. The way they understood due process was not just the processes of the law itself, but also the substance of the law, right, violated this provision. And so they believed any judge could strike down slavery. On the legislative end, Douglass believed that Congress could control the interstate slave trade, for instance, which was one of the mechanisms that really kept slavery alive in the Union, right? Slave states that didn't need as many slaves were sending them to slave states that could use more. Well, Congress can play a role. And then the executive, well, if there's ever a slave rebellion and a state sues the federal government for protection, Douglass said, why not use federal government troops, right, to end slavery? This ends the rebellion. This ensures your Republican form of government. So those are the different kinds of arguments that led one to either the anti-slavery position or the abolition position towards the Constitution.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to learn a little more about the Ashbrook Center and how you can help us continue our work with teachers, students, and citizens.
I'm Chad Kiefer, Director of Philanthropy and Strategic Partnerships here at Ashbrook. At its heart, America's story is about the lives of patriots who have given their last full measure of devotion to preserve and protect what it means to be an American. But the tragic truth is that the American story is being rewritten as one of oppression and despair. Back in 1776, the founders took a chance when they created a new government built on principles of liberty. They took a chance on America. Now I'm challenging you to do the same. Your gift to Ashbrook today reaches students, teachers, and citizens across the country, helping them to understand why America is worthy of their devotion. With so many forces eroding our history and taking away from our principles, isn't it time we give America a chance? Your investment is encouraged now more than ever. Please visit us today at ashbrook.org/support.
Is it fair to say that that I'm thinking about sort of the philosophical underpinnings of both of these positions, whether it's the abolitionist interpretation of the Constitution or the anti-slavery Republican interpretation? Did Frederick Douglass share Abraham Lincoln's understanding that underneath the Constitution is a philosophy of natural rights, which you could trace back to documents like the Declaration of Independence?
He did. And this will be helpful for those who are interested to learn exactly how. My book will be very helpful in this regard, because it wasn't a difference on understanding the Declaration, understanding natural rights, or how those things related to slavery. Actually, all anti-slavery and abolitionists, constitutionalists, if you will, they all agreed that the Constitution imbibed the Declaration that you can find in the preamble of the Constitution, its purposes, right, to establish justice, promote liberty, right? These things are all homages to the Declaration and natural rights, which means the end of slavery. But for Abraham Lincoln and others, as opposed to Douglass, when you're looking at the Constitution and you're trying to interpret ambiguities, right? So let's take the Fugitive Slave Clause. I think this is a really helpful example. The Fugitive Slave Clause is rather ambiguous. It doesn't name slaves, right? It says persons held to service or labor. Another interesting thing, which we've kind of lost in our views of the past, but they understood very well at this time in the 1850s, was it doesn't actually have any enumeration of federal power in that clause, right? So if you look at other clauses in Article 4, there are strict or specific grants of power to the federal government to enforce them. Suspiciously, that clause doesn't have one. And this is where the abolitionist Constitution in Douglass and the anti-slavery Constitution in Lincoln separate. They look at this ambiguity. Douglass says, well, to resolve this, we look at the original understanding, but specifically in terms of natural rights. What is the natural right of any individual? Obviously, it's to be free. So for persons held to service or labor, the only person you can enforce this clause against would be something like an indentured servant, someone who actually contracted, right, for the relationship. Then you could enforce the relationship.
Someone who is, of their own volition, was not legally free in that respect.
That is right. That is right. So from Douglass's position, you start with natural rights, which means that the Fugitive Slave Clause could never be applied to a fugitive slave. It was misnamed in Douglass's own sense. Now, Abraham Lincoln and others who thought about the Constitution like him, they would actually start from a federal power question, right? So when they face an ambiguity, yeah, you look to the original understanding, but really we look to understanding what was the relation between the federal government and the states, right? Was there an actual grant of federal power in this regard, or was there not? This would be the first question to answer. So even though they both agreed on what natural rights required, they disagreed at what point does the Declaration matter in interpreting the Constitution. So for certain clauses, Lincoln would say, yes, that's right. But before you even get to natural rights, I think Lincoln and others who thought about the Constitution like him, they want to know first, wait, does the federal government have power here? So then you can see the difference in looking at the Bill of Rights for Douglass as opposed to Lincoln. It's not that they understood that the requirements under the Bill of Rights were different. It's just that they believed, Douglass believed that the federal government had power to enforce it everywhere. Lincoln believed they only had power to enforce it in the territories, right? And that was really the difference.
And I guess then that would mean that natural rights philosophy and presumption of federal power was a key element of what you call Douglas's constitutional abolitionism.
That's right. Yeah, federal power is something that I think scholars haven't looked closely enough at in how abolitionists and other anti-slavery advocates understood federal power. Because I think sometimes we focus too much on the end results, right? In other words, well, Lincoln, he wasn't a true abolitionist, right? Because he wasn't willing to, use federal power to end slavery in the states. I think that's wrong. I think it's just the way he understood federal power was much more circumscribed, much more strictly construed, if you will, as opposed to Douglass, who, frankly, he was a nationalist, right? He believed that the federal government had the ample means necessary to protect natural rights everywhere in the Union.
You mentioned it at the beginning, Frederick Douglass went from slave to activist to statesman. What an interesting way to talk about his progression of his life and of his thought. Um, his encounter with Lincoln in the Civil War
Hmm.
and what appears to be, I don't know if it's a shifting view of Abraham Lincoln or it's a more fully developing view. Certainly by the end of the war, and Lincoln and he have an exchange about Lincoln's second inaugural, for example. How did Douglass become more of a statesman in his thought as time went on?
Yeah, so actually, the Civil War is really great to see how Douglass evolved in his position towards the Republican Party, for instance. I mean, so for instance, in 1860, right, everyone's gearing up for the election. Lincoln's on his ticket, and Douglass believed that the Republican Party had sort of made a deal with the devil, right? Because they weren't willing to take these anti-slavery arguments to their full conclusion or their natural conclusion in his mind, which was abolition everywhere. And he was actually rather critical of Lincoln, right, in the early years of the Civil War. Now, Lincoln, interestingly, and this shows just how prominent Douglass was, even in 1860, 1861, 1862. Just think about it. This is an African American man who was born in slavery, and then he's freed, and now he's using his voice to advocate for abolition. Lincoln, the president of the United States, tells people in his cabinet, "Who is this Frederick Douglass? We need to get him in my office because I'm tired of seeing these op-eds that Douglass is writing about me." So he brings him into his office, and at that point, Douglass really shifted his tune towards Lincoln. He said something to the effect of reporting later in his life. You can see this in the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He says something to the effect of, "Abraham Lincoln was the first American that never made me feel the color of my skin." Right, one of the first Americans. Now he in the UK, he had a very different experience. But in America, Lincoln was one of the first people who he ever felt he wasn't being prejudiced simply because of the color of his skin. And he's, like you said, conversing with Lincoln, right, about what the Black man needs at the time. And Douglass is pushing, right, for Blacks to participate in the Civil War. This would be a huge part in having them be accepted into the polity. And then seeing Lincoln, I think, work carefully through that problem, I think helped Douglass to start to see, oh, to be a statesman, one can't just have principles. One has to act within a political moment, right? Which means sometimes you might have to sacrifice the theoretically pure for the political necessity or the politically possible.
That remark reminds me so strongly of Douglas's wonderful oration. I think it's in 1876 in memory of Abraham Lincoln, where he says that I think something to the extent of viewed from genuine abolition ground, Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent.
Mhm.
But viewed from the ground of a statesman, which he was bound to consult, he seemed radical, swift, zealous, and determined. Um,
Mhm.
tell a little bit more about what Douglass understood by statesmanship, particularly as it went through the course of the Civil War.
Yeah. And then, another comment from that very same speech, right? He says that Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, right? Now, in his mind, that didn't necessarily disparage the legacy of Lincoln. It just stated a fact, right? That Lincoln was preeminently concerned with, white men in the Union. Now, but why was Lincoln concerned with the interests and opinions of white men? I think because Lincoln knew how the sausage gets made. Right? He knew how things get done. And Douglass, I think, started to see this, right? So you can even see this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right, in 1858, and then leading into the Civil War. Lincoln, you have to read carefully, right? But he continually talks about popular prejudices. He always says something effective, well, I might do this, right? But popular prejudice would certainly prevent it. And popular prejudice would say I should do Y instead of X. And I think Douglass, especially once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, I think Douglass really cued in on, oh, I see what the end game is for Lincoln, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all the slaves in the Union, right? It only frees the slaves in the rebel states. But for Douglass, that was the turning point that made very clear that, oh, okay, I've been preaching an abolition war. Lincoln has been saying this is a war for union, but the Emancipation Proclamation, even as limited as it was a very clear indication that no, this is an abolition war for everyone. Lincoln as well. And this is just his means, right, of achieving abolition. And so Douglass, he didn't mince words in that oration, right? Because if he were in the same position, he probably would have pushed harder. And I think that's partly what he's getting at in the sense of this is a white man's president, and from an abolitionist position, right, he wasn't very quick. But when you take, I guess, full scope of everything, he was swift, he was radical, he was zealous. Even if Douglass might have done things differently, I think he acknowledged that Lincoln always had the program of abolition in his mind and just carefully plotted how he thought that could be achieved. And well, I mean, history is written by the winners, and Lincoln won, right? So in some respects, you could argue easily that Lincoln was right.
Well, what about the Emancipation Proclamation and anti-slavery actions during the course of the Civil War? So, for example, you seem to be suggesting that Frederick Douglass really obviously welcomed the Emancipation Proclamation. Um, some of the most radical abolitionists were wondering, though, but this is not the same as abolition across the country. Why don't we take that next step? Let's do it immediately. Lincoln's revocation of General Fremont's Emancipation
Yeah.
Proclamation, Missouri, for example, is this really limited? Is it meant to last? Um, talk a little bit more about how Douglass received the Emancipation Proclamation, but more particularly maybe how he thought, okay, and how can we use this now to further the ends of constitutional abolition through the rest of the war?
I guess one could argue maybe Douglass was disingenuous. I don't think he was, but he used the Emancipation Proclamation as a renewed platform for preaching the abolitionist war. And while before he was critical of Lincoln and his administration for not being abolitionist, he was touting this document everywhere he was going, saying, well, look, it's obvious that this is an abolitionist administration. This is an abolitionist war. All we now need to do is win the war. And he pushed even more for that reason for blacks to enter, right, to enlist. Because before it was, well, blacks should enlist, right, in order to show that we're deserving of citizenship, show that, we are part of the Union. But once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Douglass, in a renewed sense, thought, well, we obviously are already a part of it. Now let's prove to everyone that we are. So he used this as a platform, right, to say, well, the administration's position is clear. You might mince words, right, or approaches, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation and exactly what it did. But in Douglass's mind, he really had no doubt, right, as to where this would go. And as it related to the Constitution, Douglass already believed, for instance, that the Constitution could abolish slavery everywhere in the Union. So in his mind, oh, Lincoln's finally tapping into the powers that he's always had, right? Was maybe sort of Douglass's position. And then when the 13th Amendment was introduced in Congress, frankly, not long thereafter, right? Douglass welcomed it with open arms. Because even though he believed ambiguities needed to be pointed in favor of natural rights, he always welcomed more and clearer language that protected natural rights.
What about the problem of full citizenship? It's one thing to abolish slavery, but it seemed like Frederick Douglass's view was not just we are free human beings, but that we are also American citizens. And we already are American citizens, and we must be treated like we are full American citizens. I'm thinking of address, for example, What the Black Man Wants in 1865. What was his view of full citizenship for African Americans under the Constitution?
Yeah. So his vision of full American citizenship actually has some grounding or some history, even in the days of St. George Tucker, for instance, and his views on the Constitution. St. George Tucker said something to the effect of any imposition or inequality between citizens produces some form of slavery, right? Whether it's chattel slavery, civil slavery, right, or political slavery, all these things show some form. So for Douglass, the full vision of citizenship was nothing short of complete and absolute equality of rights in every facet of the public, right, or the political sphere, if you will. And the most important right amongst all of those rights was voting rights. Enfranchisement was the key because for Douglass, if you didn't have voting rights, any other rights, even if you had under the law, all citizens shall be treated equally and have equal rights. If you couldn't vote, for him, those things read more like privileges because you had no means to actually protect yourself and ensure that your rights were going to be guaranteed through the political process.
So, did he think, and there was some constitutional argument about this, at the end of the Civil War, then, when the 13th Amendment has been adopted, some people argued now that we have this constitutional amendment and the end of slavery, that automatically confers all of the privileges of citizenship, full legal freedoms, full legal equality, and we don't need a 14th Amendment or a 15th Amendment
Yeah, right.
as we end up with. Where did Douglass fall on this, and what was his view of what obviously has become one of the most important constitutional amendments ever, the 14th Amendment?
And this is where I would say Douglass's prudence started to come in. And I think he learned from Lincoln in some respects how to be prudent, because let's think about it from Douglass's constitutional perspective. So yeah, once you free the slave and it's obvious that they're free, right, in the Union, then yes, according to that same article that allowed for the recovery of fugitive slaves also granted and guaranteed certain privileges and immunities of citizenship, right? And Douglass believed that that was a very capacious clause, right, that guaranteed all rights and privileges, so that going back to like St. George Tucker, there was no slavery in any form, right, because everyone was equal. But Douglass at this point was well seasoned as well. He realized that his constitutional arguments, even if I might find them rather convincing and also intriguing, well, many didn't quite see it that way, or they didn't see the Constitution the same way. So for Douglass, it was obvious that even if the Constitution had the language, if construed properly in favor of natural rights, would protect everyone's rights, it was obvious without very specific and clear language, there would be some cabals somewhere in the United States that would interpret the Constitution inappropriately to either disenfranchise or otherwise negate the rightful place of certain citizens. So that's why, even though he loved the 13th Amendment, he pushed for the 14th. He pushed for the 15th Amendment because he wanted very clear language that could not be denied, right? That would guarantee the rights of the now recently freedmen.
As you look over the course of Douglass's life and thought on abolition and full citizenship for African Americans, maybe it's not a fair question, but you're a scholar of Frederick Douglass and a very deep and profound one. If you can narrow it down, what do you think his greatest contribution is to constitutional understanding and constitutional thinking? Why does he deserve our attention as a constitutional thinker, as you argue?
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit on this because I think there are two fundamental contributions that he makes. The first
That's fair.
contribution,
It's hard to narrow it down to one.
yeah. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you two key contributions that he makes. First, I think he actually, if you take his arguments as to the anti-slavery nature of the Constitution, well, in one respect, from our position today, that doesn't really matter, right? Because we have the 13th Amendment, and why do we need to think about the Constitution's relation to slavery? So for this first point, that doesn't matter. For the second point, I think it will. But for the first point, why even bother? I would say you have to look carefully at his method. I think he actually, in a deep way, tries to understand the very nature of law itself, right? And written constitutions. And what does it mean for interpretation? So in some ways, that's a timeless question, right? And a question that is very much important for us today. How do we view our Constitution and how do we understand its provisions? The Supreme Court today continues to hear cases, and they always will, right? Seminal, important cases that make up the fabric of American life in a lot of ways, as they address especially the 14th Amendment. And I think it would behoove the court, for instance, to think carefully about how someone like Frederick Douglass approached the Constitution. I have in my article, right, a very careful analysis of that, but essentially it's, yes, like the court does today, an original understanding. You have to grapple with the original understanding of the Constitution, but Douglass has the spin where he says, but you have to remember the nature of law itself, right, which is to protect natural rights. So you can't possibly even consider history, right, or original understanding without a proper understanding of natural rights and what they require. And this has to influence how you understand history. Now, originalists today, I don't think they do that. I think they basically just look at history from a sort of amoral perspective, right? Of, well, let's just see what these words meant, and then let's cobble together a meaning, and then simply apply it. Douglass wouldn't have done that, right? So that's the first contribution. The second and equally important contribution, well, even if you're not on the court, even if you're not a lawyer, I think the average citizen should pay attention to Frederick Douglass, because also, again, understanding history, understanding the nature of slavery, I think he does answer a really important question about the Constitution's legacy itself, right? So one question that maybe the average citizen doesn't ask themselves, but maybe they should at least reflect on it. Should you actually have loyalty, and should you be bound, right, to this Constitution? Does it deserve your loyalty and respect? Douglass has a very intricate, interesting, and I think compelling answer to that question. The answer is yes. But if you understand properly, right, the Constitution's legacy, understand properly its history, and then you can extrapolate that to our nation's history, our nation's founding, right? It's not to be naive and to suggest that there was never a dark moment in history, right, in American history. Yes, there were several dark moments. Some can argue there are dark moments today, right? They might be of different natures, but we continue to struggle with issues that, as we're trying to achieve this project that the Declaration pronounced, understanding that all are created equal and treating them as such. Douglass believed this was our deeper legacy, right? And I think the average citizen would take a lot if they spend a little bit of time with Frederick Douglass and answering this own question in their own context today.
Well, I have to tell you, Brad, you have made a fabulous argument for why Douglass might be the first most important, but it's certainly a compelling argument for why Frederick Douglass deserves our attention, our thought, our care, and why your book needs to be read by folks out there who are listening and by many, many others, including perhaps people in on the Supreme Court and throughout the federal court system. Again, everybody, the book is Until Every Yoke is Broken, Frederick Douglass's Constitutional Abolitionism. Our guest for this wonderful conversation today is Professor Bradley Rebeiro. Brad, again, thanks for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.